Thank you very much for the invitation. In my presentation, I would like to address why the issue of the Hungarian euro became actual again. György, the governor of the Hungarian Central Bank, in a recent interview said that perhaps around 2030 or a bit later we could reach 90% of the EU's average in terms of development. Then it is worth entering the eurozone, as the euro has many advantages. It is a rather sharp turn from the governor, because 4 years ago he said that the euro is the result of a harmful dogma, and it is time to wake up from this fruitless dream. So this is interesting for me for this, and interesting because the date of accession has been off the agenda for a while in Hungary. Of course, it would require government decision to introduce the euro, but at least it is on the agenda again. In my presentation, I will make some remarks on the so-called half-built house, that is the eurozone. Then I will make a literature review, both studies made by the Hungarian Central Bank and independent academics. And then I will briefly analyze Hungarian convergence data to see how close or far we are from the eurozone. So what is this half-built house, as it was called by Bergsten? It means that the eurozone is far from being an optimum currency area, as first portrayed by Mádl and Balassa back in the 60s. As for the Hungarian scientific literature, Buda Lorina, in her PhD thesis, provides a good analysis of the structural problems of the eurozone through the so-called economic impossible trinities. György, the former governor of the Hungarian Central Bank, said that the eurozone will never be an optimum currency area without creating a fiscal and political union. But following this train of thoughts, Gottfried asked whether the European decision makers will ever reach the consensus on crossing the red line. In his view, it seems unlikely. However, it is clear that every step backward seems to cause irreparable harm. And it is no wonder that Stiglitz wrote in 2010, when the Greek sovereign debt crisis started to evolve, that it is going to be extremely difficult now to return from scrambled eggs back to intact ones. It means that if you enter the eurozone, there is no plan B. Nobody can imagine what will happen if it ever fails. That's why Draghi had his very famous "whatever it takes" speech back in 2012. So, as for the Hungarian official opinion from the Hungarian Central Bank, there is a study made by Kisgergely and Szombati back in 2014. As for the cons, they argue that the loss of monetary sovereignty is a very big issue. It's an important question. They also argue that the competence between the community and domestic supervisory authorities were not clear enough, and the mechanism seemed to be bureaucratic, and no clear rules existed on the burden of crisis management. I have to mention that it was almost 10 years ago. In my opinion, the banking union evolved a lot, and this mechanism functions quite well. As for the pros, they mention the feeling of belonging to the core, and also the access to the crisis management fund, which is greater than Hungary could create alone. And they also argue that the European Central Bank's professionalism is higher than the national central bank's professionalism. In a more recent study, that is to say two more recent studies, Nagy and Virág and then Virág alone, argued that there is no automatic real convergence with accession. On the other hand, failure is sure in case of premature accession. It is supported by individual academics as well in the scientific literature. Therefore, they elaborated on the so-called Maastricht 2.0 criteria, which they argue is important to fulfill before Hungary can access to the Eurozone. For example, the GDP per capita level and wage levels should reach at least 90% of the Euro area. Synchronized business and financial cycles are needed. The economy should be close to full employment. Advanced, stable and competitive financial sector is needed. An available, effective, counter-cyclical political toolkit and structural balance should be completed. Now let's see the independent academics. I identified four groups. The first one is about the real convergence. And as you will see, just like in the Czech Republic, there was an euphoria at the beginning, and then as more and more voices warned to the possible risk and other unwanted effects, they started to see it in a more realistic way. For example, Csajbók and Csermely back in 2002 wrote that the introduction of the euro would help the Hungarian economic growth. However, they also warned to some issues that should be taken into consideration. Just a few years later, Mihály wrote that the fulfillment of the Maastricht criteria is necessary and at the same time insufficient to reach real convergence. And that is now the mainstream line in the Hungarian scientific literature. As Darvas and Szapáry wrote in 2008, the common monetary policy induces the less developed member states to excessive borrowing. And I have to say that the Greek sovereign debt crisis proved their thesis to be correct. That was one of the problems in case of Greece. Neményi and Oblát also says that the accession in itself does not bring real convergence. And also Darvas, in a more recent study, argues that it is not the euro which causes the problem in the country, but it is the country's internal structural problems, insufficient demand, poor budget structure, wage increases in excess of productivity. That was the case with Greece and Spain as well. The second group of opinions revolve around the promise of economic advantages. Based on the comparative study made by Kutassy and Nagy, with a view to the V4 countries, that is to say the Slovakian euro versus the national currencies of the Czech Republic, Poland and Hungary, they found that there are no significant advantages. These countries either perform similarly. Sometimes the non-Eurozone countries outperform the Eurozone member. Sorry, Professor. The conclusion is, in their view, that the country may be successful with or without euro as well. These findings are supported by Darvas and Gottfried. And also Menik Jónás argues that Hungary's import-export volume to the EU is already really high. It has almost reached the potential maximum, that is to say, no room for further development in her view. The third category is about the fear of losing monetary sovereignty. It's a quite often cited argument, for example, in the studies made by the Hungarian Central Bank. However, the ex-governor Surányi argues that since the Hungarian economy is a small and open one, the fully independent monetary policy is only an illusion. Therefore, losing it is not an unacceptable sacrifice. And at this point, I have to note that during his term as a governor, he was very skeptical with the euro. But nowadays, he seems like supporting the euro. Maybe it is a characteristic of the Hungarian governors of the central bank. They start from a skeptical tone to be supportive towards the euro. Or within their mandate. Also, Székely argues that the tool of devaluation is only enough to buy time, but only in a limited extent and only in order to facilitate other economic measures to solve the problem. That is to say, this monetary tool, in his view, is overvaluated. Does it have any prestige value? According to Gottfried, the accession itself does not have any prestige value. We are already devoted to the EU and to the NATO. However, he also argues that due to the Brexit and due to the shrinking number of countries staying out, the less power those decide to keep out will have. We have to count with this issue as well. Vértes argues that from an economic point of view, there is not a single date which is absolutely perfect for the accession. That is to say, it is an issue which has to be decided by politicians and not economic professionals. And the fifth one is only consists of one opinion, but I can really relate to this. The original sin was pushing the deadline again and again, inducing unfounded expectations in the economic operators and the population. A more straightforward communication would have been necessary. That is to say, Mihály argues that governments should have decided whether to introduce the euro and do it within the deadline, or tell the people that we don't want euro. As for the surveys, currently Hungarian citizens are the most supportive among the non-Eurozone V4 countries for the introduction of the euro. And also economic operators think that Hungary is ready for the introduction of the euro, and it will be it would have very positive effects on the economy. And in the third part, I will talk about the convergence data. I don't want to bore you to tears, so I will be fast on this. But as you can see, in 2004, when the country, when Hungary entered into the European Union, we were far from complying with these criteria. Also in 2010, when the Greek sovereign crisis broke out and the current government won the elections for the first time, we were also far from these criteria. And only in 4 years we started to getting close to comply with these criteria. And this period lasted until 2020. So in this, in my opinion, within this period, we could have access to the Eurozone with a little extra effort exerted. And as you can see, after the COVID and other unfortunate events, we have started to depart from the Maastricht criteria, so our indicators are deteriorating. So to summarize what I just talked about, in my view, the studies of the Hungarian Central Bank show a cautious, or rather a skeptical attitude, and tend to focus on the negative sides of the introduction of the euro. And they are a bit neglecting the positive sides of the common currency. As for the evolution of the Hungarian scientific community, opinion shows that the initial optimism before and around the time of Hungary's EU accession started to erode as more and more voices warned to the risk and undesired effects. But it is common both in the Hungarian Central Bank studies and in the academics' opinion that real convergence became the key word in these studies. We have to reach a certain level of convergence before we could access. Between 2014 and 2020, Hungary would have had the opportunity to introduce the euro, in my opinion. And of course, I don't want to place myself into the position of the decision makers because I don't share their responsibility. I'm only a university teacher who can say whatever he wants, and nobody cares. Maybe Professor Szilágyi will tell me that I don't have to go to work one day, but anyway. So my question is whether we should have introduced the euro taking into consideration the current risk factors, because once there was an opportunity and we are starting to depart from this opportunity, and we have to face some problems like the post-COVID economic effects and the Russia-Ukrainian war and its negative effects. Thank you very much for your attention.